Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gabby Hunt, and I'm a program coordinator here at the Stevens Initiative. If you are brand new to the Stevens Initiative, or this is your first event that you're attending of ours, welcome. We are really glad to have you. As a brief background on our work, the Stevens Initiative is an international leader in virtual exchange. We are supported by the US Department of State, the Bezos Family Foundation, the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, and we are housed at the Aspen Institute. Our work focuses on three areas. We award grants to virtual exchange programs that connect young people in the United States, in the Middle East, and North Africa. We also advocate for more widespread adoption of virtual exchange through trainings, events like this, and other campaigns. And we also serve as a knowledge hub for virtual exchange by creating and supporting research on virtual exchange design and practice. And our discussion today will most closely relate to that area. I'm really excited for what we have planned because while we share a lot about our knowledge, it's obviously a big part of our work. We don't often talk about the methods or evaluation that goes into gathering that research and those insights. And we also don't really talk much about challenges that implementers and practitioners face with this part of the work or gaps that are in the field. So this is really exciting, and I'm honored to be joined by my fellow Stevens Initiative colleague, Kyle Kassler, as well as Linda Stewart from AFS and Salma El-Bablawi from SOLIA. All of the research that we mention here today can be found on our resources page on the website, and Linda's research in particular can be found on our sponsored research update, so you can just kind of search that and that blog should come up. And then Solia's quasi-experimental design results, which Salma will talk about in a little bit, can also be found in the 2000 and 2022 Virtual Exchange Impact and Learning Report. As a final reminder before we get started, the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen is now open, so please feel free to drop in a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll leave some time at the end to answer as much as we can. So I will go ahead and get started with the main part of our discussion. There are so many ways that impact can be measured in the virtual exchange field, and each of you has a different example of evaluation to offer. So to begin, can you share an overview of research findings or anecdotes about the impact of virtual exchange from your work? And Kyle, I would love to start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I'm really excited to be here today. Also, to share a little bit about our work with the attendees and to be here with Linda and Zalma and yourself. And so, yeah, to start off an answer to this question, I should probably once again reference, and then I won't reference it anymore, the data and the research that the Stevens Initiative has developed and shared that we feature on our resources page. So I assume that many of the attendees today have accessed our resource page before, but if you haven't, I encourage you at stevensinitiative.org and then click resources. And there you'll see our impact and learning report that Gabby mentioned. We have multiple impact and learning reports from a number of different years listed on that resources page. And this is where we publish our program evaluation data and good practices for implementers. So the Stevens Initiative partners with an independent evaluator, RTI International, to help evaluate the different gains and global competencies that participants in our virtual exchange programs develop during a part of their exchanges. So that's something that I would encourage people to read through. Those reports show sustained or yearly positive effects along multiple global competencies for many of our virtual exchange participants. On that resources page, we also share our survey of the field that measures the amount and types of virtual exchange happening. And I think that reflects some different, the impacts of virtual exchange in the wider education field. And so I think that's important to look at also. And then some of the different sponsored research that we do. Linda will talk about her project, but we've sponsored lots of different types of research from the Stevens Initiative on different aspects of virtual exchange that I encourage people to look at too. Very quickly, beyond that, I think there are lots of ways to think about impact. I think research anecdotes. I think what one might be interested on and depends on who you're talking to or who wants to know about that impact. So it's important to share data on what participants are learning in virtual exchange, like our global competency domains. But and I think we've developed a robust process to evaluate that development in our programs. And some examples of global competencies could be cross-cultural collaboration or empathy development. But another important thing that we do at the Stevens Initiative is gather and share stories of impact and success in partnership with our grantees. We bring alumni and participant voices to the front of people's screens, and we try to articulate the value of virtual exchange using their words. And so gathering these voices, to me, is just as important as the evaluation and the data work that we do. So yeah, I want to stop there, and I'd love to hear what Linda and Zama think about this question too.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. I'm happy to go next if that works, Gabby. So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Linda with AFS International. And AFS has a lot of impact goals, including developing active global citizens as one, which we do through mobility exchange programs and also now virtual exchange. In 2020, I found myself, probably not unlike many of you, working on alternative ways to have our students engaging in the learning and continuing to become global citizens. And we had to accelerate what we were working on to meet the demands of a then shut down world and dabble more into virtual exchange. So it was a fast start. The good news is we had some things developed. And what we did is we took our online learning curriculum and converted it into what we call a true virtual exchange, and offered that to, first of all, the 7,000 students that we had to repatriate from around the world. But we didn't want this to just be a pandemic solution only. We really wanted this to be a way to engage more and more people from our global network. And so we developed the Global U Adventurer program, which is our signature virtual exchange program. And that program became sort of the subject of the research that we did in 2021, and much thanks to the grant we received from the Stevens Initiative. So essentially, I can talk a little bit about the program and then a little just briefly about the research. It's a 5-week virtual exchange. It was open to 14 and 17-year-olds from around the world. And the goal was really to develop global competence skills and become active global citizens. We know that teens from around the world can find themselves in virtual settings on lots of online platforms, but those platforms are not necessarily intentional. And we wanted to provide a facilitated learning experience for them where they could gain these specific global competence skills. And so what we did is we ended up with about 150 students in the study, including a control group of 34. And they came from 19 countries. The control group came from 19 countries. And the students that received the program, the Global U Adventurer program, came from 35 countries. So we had lots and lots of different countries represented. We had diversity in gender as well as languages. So we had 26 native English speakers and then 93 multilingual participants. I should continue, right? To tell a little bit more about the study. Okay, so just in brief, that's kind of who made up the study. And again, what we really wanted to measure was whether or not virtual exchange developed the global competence skills in these youth. And we also had a secondary question, which unfortunately we did not end up with enough evidence to pretty much find any results or claim on this, but we wanted to know if more time, more real life time together made a difference. So back to the first question, does virtual exchange develop elements of global youth competence? We had a mixed method approach. So we had pre and post surveys. We used both a standard assessment, IES, which I find to be quite approachable and accessible for youth. There are many that are out there. We ended up with the IES survey, and we used the Stevens Initiative Common Survey questions as well. So those were the two pre and post questionnaires that we used, as well as some analysis of the students' comments on the chat and on the forum and the observation of those live sessions. in the end, what we found was that the students who participated in our Global U Adventure program grew 3 times more than the students who were in the control group. And the 2 areas that caught our attention in particular were positive regard. Positive regard kind of being defined as withholding judgment about a situation, something that is new or unfamiliar to you. We found this to be really important, a really important finding, because, you know, I mean, it can be quite common. It can actually be developmentally appropriate for students who are 14 to 17 years old to make judgments, right? We all make judgments. And that can help with their identity. It can help them identify where they are in this world, who they are in this world. But through the program, the students who took the GYA, the Global U Adventure, were more likely to withhold judgments about people that were new and unfamiliar to them. So that was a particularly encouraging finding. And then the second finding was relationship development. The students in the program grew 2 times more than students in the control group. And this was also an interesting and surprising finding for us, given that this was in a virtual setting. So what this meant was the extent to which one is likely to maintain a positive relationship with someone of a different culture or different from them. The students on the virtual exchange were 2 times more likely to do that. And so I think, you know, just there were lots of findings, as Kyle mentioned. The full report is available on the website, but just to highlight some of the things that really caught our attention that we were really pleased to see.
Thank you, Linda. Actually, it's good that I'm going after you because you gave a good context for a similar study we ran at Solia. So my name is Salma Biblawi. I am the Chief Program Officer at Solia. Solia is a nonprofit that's been specializing in virtual exchanges for 20 years. We've been offering and designing dialogue and training programs for all those years, using Solia's very specific methodology for learning and engagement. And throughout those 20 years, we've been seeing very consistent positive impacts throughout our studies, and we're excited to talk about specifically the quasi-experimental design mentioned by Gabby earlier. In general, I'd like to start by saying that, like all providers, we look at impact through a combination of tools. Both Kyle and Linda referenced some of these approaches. We use quantitative, using pre-program surveys, post-program surveys, qualitative approaches, as well as, but including stories, anecdotes, interviews, etc. We try to collect information from the participants themselves, as well as feedback and observation from their university professors on their individual campuses, and our virtual exchange facilitators who are in the rooms managing the virtual exchanges. We also collect feedback and information from them. This is to help us get a more comprehensive picture of the impact. So the study that I'll talk about now is somewhat similar to what Linda described. So in general, I'll say Solia tries to conduct a more rigorous impact assessment study about every 2 years. And with the support of the Stevens Initiative, we ran such an evaluation in 2020 and 21. And we use, seems like a similar design that Linda described, pre-program, post-program surveys among both participants in our virtual exchange, but also among what is referred to as a control group or a comparison group, which consists of university students who are as similar as possible to the participants in the program. So we try to match them across a variety of demographics and backgrounds and a variety of factors. This is to ensure that they're as comparable as possible to the participants in the program. The purpose of these kinds of studies, when you bring in a control or a comparison group, is really to help answer the question of Well, how do you know the impact you're seeing is really due to the program experience and not due to other factors that are happening in students' lives outside of their experience in the program? That's really the purpose of running such studies, and that's what we hope to gain understanding of by running these studies. So once we run the study, look at the change that is observed among participants and the change observed among the control or comparison group, we can more confidently then attribute the changes observed among the participants directly to their participation in the program and not to other variables in their life. That's what we're trying to do through these studies. Like Linda's study, we were also very pleasantly surprised or very happy with the results that we saw. Across the 5 different categories of assessment around global competencies, we saw a significant improvement among the participants in the virtual exchange that were statistically significant higher than the control group. So that's very promising results. It allows us to say with confidence that the virtual exchange experience was successful in impacting the participants in the ways that we hoped. I didn't prepare some highlights of the results as Linda did, but very happy to share the results after this meeting. And as Gabby said, they're available on the Stevens Initiative resource section.
Thank you all for that really helpful context to each of the areas that you're kind of speaking on today. I know that it's easy to talk about these findings for a really long time, and we could talk about all of them in a whole webinar, but I really appreciate that because I think that sets the stage well for our following questions. Kyle, I like that you mentioned that impact can be defined in a lot of ways to different people. I think our next question, there are a lot of different answers to this, but in all of your views, why are efforts to demonstrate the impact of virtual exchange important? What is maybe the most important part about demonstrating impact? And whoever would like to start first, go ahead.
I can go first, and then maybe I'll turn it back to Salma, just so we know where we're going. So it's a really good question. Like, why is it important to demonstrate the impact of virtual exchange? And I think from I want to give 2 different answers. One, I think it's important for us to understand the impact that virtual exchange has in the lives of young people. I think when we talk about those anecdotes, like Gabby, you just mentioned, if you go to the Stevens Initiative website and go to our stories page, we have, I think, the 2 most recent stories. One from our grantee at LaGuardia Community College, just shares such a great insight into what a virtual exchange program is like and the impact that it had on participants during the program. And then the next story you would see was from a young virtual exchange participant in Yemen about participating in multiple virtual exchange programs and the impact that it's had on his trajectory as an alum. I think those are really important stories to share to kind of help us understand, or help people understand who might not be familiar with virtual exchange, what exactly virtual exchange is. I think another reason why it's important, and I think we saw both Salma and Linda do this, I think they were very careful in their answers to your first question. As international educators in general, or virtual exchange practitioners, I think we need to be really specific about the claims we make about the programs we offer, right? We can't say, we could say virtual exchange changes young people's lives, or virtual exchange helps young people gain all the global competencies. But what does that mean? What exactly are the goals of our programs? What are they trying to reach? How do we measure against those goals? Are really important questions. And so the specific data and specific outcomes can be helpful when we're recruiting participants or institutional partners. So if needs and goals align, this helps to grow programs because we're bringing more young people into them. Also, being able to talk about impact is also really important because it can help open doors to more funding, and more funding again allows more young people to join virtual exchange programs, and so allows more young people to have a global learning experience, which is what I think one of the reasons a lot of us come into this field. Yeah, it's also, again, like it's important to remember that different stakeholders need to see different types of impact. So some need to see data, some need to see stories, some need to see other impact. And so I think that's why these efforts are important, because it helps us, expand access to these important programs that we know have affected change in young people's lives.
Maybe I'll go next, Kyle, and thank you for that. Maybe I'll take a step back a little bit. Why is it important to do impact assessment in general? I think anyone, we all have our personal convictions for effort we think are worthwhile, that would lead to positive change in the world. And we try to think about the theory of change that supports that. But even with a very solid theory of change, we still need to put that to the test. Does it actually work? Before, like you said, related to funding, before we invest time and effort and resources towards any activity, we need to know, does it actually work? And especially for a new and growing field like virtual exchange, truly understanding the impact and being able to back this with data and with anecdotes and stories is super important. And then more specifically, each provider has certain goals and methodologies for their programs. Evaluation of these programs or activities can help us dig deeper to understand not just whether it works, but are we doing it in the right approach? What type of changes are we seeing more of or less of? What are different elements in our design that seem to be affecting change more than others? So all of these can help us better understand and define the goals that are being achieved, but also it gives us information about how to improve our program design in the future and how to strengthen our programming to solidify the impact or increase the impact in different ways.
Yeah, I think exactly what both of you have already shared is really applicable, has been really applicable for us as well, and demonstrate the reasons why this, these impact efforts, capturing them and demonstrating impact is really important. I think the last thing you just said, Salma, around, growing the programs, improving the programs, answering programmatic questions can be really helpful. I mentioned earlier that we were trying to ask a second question about dosage, about real-time live sessions, and we didn't quite get enough data to be statistically significant in our findings. However, there were suggestions from the students that, of course, they wanted more time. They wanted more time, real time with each other, not so much time, on the online modules or in the online forums. They wanted more face time, which can be really challenging when you're working across 24 time zones, of course. And then there's that impact question, because like at what point, how many sessions, how much live time really makes a difference, and at what point might it start to kind of actually taper back down? And for organizations and institutions, it becomes a question as well of how much resources to put toward this. I mean, the students want to connect forever, that's great, but at what point does it maybe stop making such a difference? And then for us too, it's really answering that question of what's working, but also what's not and what's missing. So through this exercise of the research, we were also able to identify pieces that were missing and that we have been able to now include and improve our program with that. I guess the last thing I would say as far as demonstrating impact is, as an organization, we also have an identity. AFS has a 75-year history of having in-person mobility exchange programs. So when we go back out to the network and say, hey, we have this alternative way that is as transformational, that can make a difference, and we can maybe even access more students. You know, like in anything, you find maybe some skeptics, some people that are a little bit hesitant, you know, they don't necessarily, it's like the proof is in the pudding. I need to see the results of this. And so that can help with our partners and our collaborators too on bringing them on board.
Thank you all for sharing those reflections. Something that jumped out on me is that I think you all kind of touched on something that we call building institutional buy-in at the Stevens Initiative, as that being a really prime motivator for impact sharing. In other words, you know, convincing the powers that be who you need to convince that virtual exchange is a worthwhile effort, that it is, because it is a lot of work. So I just wanted to single out that point. My next question is, obviously virtual exchange has gained a lot of traction in the pandemic. Linda, I know that you had talked about this being kind of a motivator for AFS getting involved in virtual exchange. But as you all know, and maybe as our audience might as well, this is a field that has been around for longer than just the past 2.5 years. So in your view, how has knowledge sharing in the field evolved or changed? And Salma, I'm actually going to call on you to start, which is perfect because there's someone in the Q&A who said that they implemented Solia in 2009 at their institution and would love to know how your approach has changed, if it has.
Great. So I'll talk about our approach for impact assessment, but happy to maybe later in the Q&A session, if this question is specifically about the programming, we could take that later. So speaking from our experience at Solia, like I mentioned, we have been running virtual exchanges for 20 years now. And from the very beginning, we knew that it was very important to pay careful attention to impact assessment. And so we designed from the very first exchange a pre-program and post-program surveys to help us not just, you know, oftentimes organizations do a post-program survey only that helps us get a sense of the impact, but really truly to see the change that could be due to the program. A pre and program are much better. So we've had this from the very beginning, which was good, but we were doing these efforts internally mostly. In 2008, we had a very important step where we forged a research partnership with the late Dr. Emile Bruneau, who was an expert in neuroscience and psychology. From his work, he had research interest in intergroup relations, intergroup understanding, empathy, and peace building. And so with the help of his expertise, we were able to take our impact assessment to another level. It felt like a big shift in professionalizing our approach to research. And it allowed us to do more rigorous assessment of our programs, starting from defining our goals. So oftentimes we say we want to achieve empathy or global citizenship. What do these things mean? When you're conducting research, you need to be very specific. And I think Kyle talked, about this earlier. Being very specific about what we're measuring. So that was very important to get that support from a professional. And then how do we, once we define the goals very specifically, how do we measure them using tested and validated measurement tools that truly would reflect change? So again, using his expertise to adapt existing and validated measurement tools to the virtual exchange field, and refining them and improving them over years. And I think some of those tools are now have become standard and accepted in the field. I know several other virtual exchange providers have been using them as well. So these efforts, I think, were very important in helping, professionalize and strengthen the virtual exchange field overall, having clear definitions of the areas that we're trying to measure, how to measure these with strong metrics, and then how to conduct research in a rigorous way. So we've definitely seen this evolution over the years. That's been great.
Maybe I can jump in here. I really appreciated Salma's perspective from an institution, like how has SOLIA evolved in how they do evaluation or knowledge creation and sharing about virtual exchange. Maybe I'll share a little bit of a different perspective as an individual. So I come from an in-person exchange background. I worked in that area of our field for a number of years, and then when I started a graduate program at the University of Maryland, I saw some innovative virtual exchanges, and I became interested in the field then. That was about in 2016, 2017, and I was I was immediately interested from a perspective that I don't think is very helpful, which is which one is better. I think they're just different, but I wanted to write my master's thesis about virtual exchange. Only I ran into some challenges when trying to come up with the literature review. There were some things out in the literature at that time about COIL, about I remember writing about SOLIA, I remember writing about the Stevens Initiative, but there wasn't a lot of research, peer-reviewed research about virtual exchange. And so and a lot of the research that was being done was from faculty, usually COIL faculty or faculty members doing COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, an approach to virtual exchange. And they were publishing about their specific courses and drawing conclusions from those exchanges. But what we've seen, I think, since then, and I wish it had happened because I would have had more to write about at that time, but we've seen an explosion of research, I think. And for example, the Journal for International Students, a very well-regarded peer-reviewed publication, excuse me, their most recent issue is a special issue on virtual exchange. And in that publication, there are 10 different peer-reviewed articles talking about research and virtual exchange, about different aspects from impact to and different approaches, qualitative, quantitative. This is huge. Another thing, the International Virtual Exchange Conference has also grown from the first time I attended as that graduate student in 2017. I think I attended then, and again, it was a lot of COIL practitioners talking about COIL. And I think since then, we've seen that conference and the research and sharing at that conference grow, people sharing about different types of impact, different program models. I think this is all due to the pioneering work by many in the field, like SOLIA, like Global Nomads Group, like the SUNY COIL office, like Unit Collaboration and others. But I also think it's maybe interest brought to the field because of the pandemic. So that's a little bit of my perspective of how it's grown.
And that are the journal that published the 10 articles and studies, Kyle, I think they received hundreds of submissions. So I think if we could read all of that has been submitted, it would be awesome. The only thing I would add is what you just said, Kyle, about a lack of peer-reviewed resources and research specifically for the K through 12 sector. So AFS provides many programs in the K through 12 sector, as well as programming for adults as well. But when we were working on our study last year, it's exactly what you said. There, we had absolutely minimal peer-reviewed research articles to tap into, to compare. So anything like a comparative study, I think, in the future, we might want to consider a repeat of this, adding more students to the program and to the research so that we can start to have some comparison. That would be helpful.
Thank you all for that. I just wanted to say before going into our next question that we will be heading into the audience Q&A portion of the webinar soon, so definitely be sure to drop in more questions. We would love to answer as many as possible. And I will ask now, in conversations prior to this live discussion, you all raised that a really large gap in knowledge about virtual exchange's impact is long-term knowledge or long-term impact. And I thought that that was really striking that all of you raised that in our conversation. So if you could each expand a little bit more on that, maybe a little bit brief, just because I really want to make sure we get to these audience questions, but definitely would love to hear your perspective on that kind of dearth of knowledge about long-term impact. And Linda, I don't know if we've started with you, if I may put you on the spot.
Sure, no problem. And again, we're a little bit newer to the experience of virtual exchange, not to exchange, but translating a lot of AFS's experiential learning and all of the connections that we have around the world into a virtual setting. So, you know, we've really only been doing this for the past couple of years. But it is on our roadmap and we're continue to plan it, and participating in the research has also been quite limited. But I think like in anything, it is important to understand the long-term impact and the longitudinal. I mean, we've done this with our mobility students. We would want to do this with our virtual exchange as well. We want to know, you know, what if this program has made a difference, you know, if it really has been what we say it is, that transformational. I can see some of the comments in the Q&A already saying that it made a difference for me. And then accessibility as well, I think is really important. So are we addressing the accessibility piece with this, and how are we addressing that year over year? So I think that would just be, you know, yeah, my brief contribution. I guess one other thing that, you know, we've seen a lot in AFS is we see a lot of that bilateral exchange. We see it with mobility. It can happen with virtual as well. As a global network with, you know, 60 organizations worldwide, we really have this ability to leverage the multilateralism of it as well. And so I think we did see that, like I mentioned with our initial study, we saw that many countries represented in the same cohorts, some of the challenges that presents, but then the benefits that the students can get, and they can reap the benefits from being in such an intentional multilateral cohort right from the start, you know, is really important.
I can maybe go next, and I'll try to keep it brief as well. We've been lucky enough to have a partnership with a social psychologist, Dr. Sandy Schumann, to run a longitudinal study. That was, I will say that we consider this only a very first step in terms of understanding the long-term impact of virtual exchange. And I will also say that the findings have just been approved for publication. So hopefully that paper will come out soon, and I'll be happy to share it. Very briefly, we surveyed about 3,000 of our students who had participated in our programs up to 18 months prior. And we looked at results over 3 time periods, just before the program, right after the program, and up to 18 months after participation. Results overall were very promising. We saw that on all the measures that we looked at, the impact seems to be sustained up to 18 months after participation. However, there were some variations on some of the areas that we measured. For some reason, again, you know, all of this requires more research to truly understand. On some measures, we saw that there were improvements between time 1 before the program, then time 2 right after the program, and then it continued to improve, you know, post our participation, while other measures improved right after the program, but then declined slightly 18 months later, still being higher than time 1 just before the program. So it seems that impact is sustained. Why different measures behave differently 18 months after participation is not clear. There's a lot more research that can be done to truly help us understand what is the long-term impact, how, what are the different variables that impact how these different metrics behave. And also, it's only 18 months after. Ideally, we want to see a much longer time span as well. But it was a good start, an initial study to help us see that it seems that the impact lasts, but a lot more to learn in this area.
Salma just made me think of one thing, if I can just add, and that is like, I wonder if there is something key about the age and the time when individuals go on these virtual exchanges. I think that would be interesting for us to continue to explore that as well. Is there a time of life when it makes more of a difference, and what difference does it make?
That's a really good point, Linda. And I think I'm looking forward to reading the research, Salma, when you all put it out from Solia. I'll try to, again, Gabby, be really quick so we can move on to the Q&A. To answer this like longitudinal question, the Stevens Initiative worked on one longitudinal study with our independent evaluators at RTI International, excuse me. And this study included 29 qualitative interviews with initiative alumni in the US and the MENA region. And just to preview it very quickly, and then I'll let other people go read it themselves. All alumni interviewed reported at least some improvement or positive change in at least one of the targeted areas in their skills and their knowledge of other cultures or in their attitudes regarding other cultures. And they tied that improvement to their participation in virtual exchange that lasted until they were interviewed. Some alumni were interviewed, like multiple years after their exchanges. So that's important. Specifically, over 85% of the alumni who participated in the interviews reported positive changes in the global competency domains of perspective taking, cross-cultural communication, and collaboration skills, and additionally, an increased interest in international experiences. And 85% of US-based alumni interviewed reported an increase in knowledge of the MENA region as a result of their participation in their virtual exchange. That research was published by NAFSA in their Research Symposium Series, Volume 5. So if you Google NAFSA Research Symposium Series, Volume 5, you'll see the Stevens Initiative Virtual Exchange Alumni Longitudinal Study there.
Thank you all. I am now going to ask the first audience question. And Kyle, I'm actually going to direct this one to you. Someone in the audience noticed that in our most recent impact and learning report, the empathy scale was removed, or there was a note that it will be removed from future evaluation efforts starting in fall 2021. Could you share more about the thinking that went into that decision?
Yeah, I could share a little bit about it, and then hopefully we'll detail it a little bit more in our upcoming Impact and Learning report that should be released in the new year. So I think the removal and even like the update of some of these scales over time, which we detail in some of the evaluation toolkits that we published on our resource page, it shows that we're constantly evolving the way that we evaluate our programs, working, and it's nice that we work with RTI International as an independent evaluator because they give us their expert insights as as evaluation experts into what the scales, the domains are actually measuring, and if they are producing, if they're reflecting the changes that we are trying to examine. And so sometimes we published some data that like we don't really understand why maybe a shift would have happened or not as big of a shift would have happened. But then sometimes RTI will do some testing of the scales and they'll find, like this scale doesn't actually, it's not reporting what we want it to report there, and there are other measures. So if we remove that specific empathy scale, is the feelings thermometer, and I will suggest that people read our evaluation toolkit or our impact and learning reports to learn a little bit more about what the feelings thermometer is, basically like how someone thinks about someone who is different than themselves and what their warm feelings are towards that that person or other culture over time, is that a better indicator of the type of impact that we're looking for? And so that's some of the reason that we update our scales over time, and why we remove some things and why we've added retrospective questions, and that kind of thing. So I think the removal of that empathy scale is, the specific answer is kind of complicated, but the reason is we want to focus our efforts on scales that are actually telling us what we want to learn about the global competency development in our participants, good and bad.
That's really insightful. Thank you for that, Kyle. Our next question, Salma, someone said, I'd love to hear more about the assessment tools that you have said become standard and accepted in the field. What tools do you find most useful for assessment?
The feeling thermometer that Kyle just referred to is one that we have consistently found to be a good measurement tool. So like Kyle said, this is a tool that asks participants to say how cold to warm they feel towards another person, another culture, another different situations that would expose them to another culture. So that one, we feel there's a lot of literature that supports the effectiveness of this tool. And we have been using it for virtual exchange for multiple years now. And it's one of the tools that's consistently showing its ability to measure change in, it's all about when you're using a new tool, you want to make sure that if you don't see a result, whether it's you're not actually affecting change, you're not achieving your goal in this area, or whether the tool is not the appropriate one, it's not sensitive enough to capture the change. And this tool seems to always show a good degree of change in a consistent way. So that consistency, trying it over and over, it gives us, strength in acknowledging it as an effective tool. So that's one. Another one also related to empathy is called self-other overlap. And a lot of the descriptions of these tools is available on our website, and probably maybe somewhere in the resource section of the Stevens Initiative website as well. The self-other overlap, again, looks at, it's one of the measures related to empathy. It specifically looks at how much commonality you feel towards another group. Whether how much you personally feel commonality between you and members of another group, or how much you feel your group, the group, whatever identity, political group, group that you belong to, how much you feel that group has commonality with other groups. And that is also backed by a lot of literature, and it's been used and validated in many fields. And we've been using it for virtual exchange as well, for multiple years, similar to the feeling thermometer. So those are two that I'd highlight now. And again, happy for people to reach out to me directly if they want more information and details.
That's great. I love the feeling thermometer. I'd actually not heard of that prior to this webinar. So that's such a cool tool to know about, and I will look forward to learning more. A question that I think maybe the whole group could possibly tackle, or anyone who has initial thoughts. How have you motivated participants to complete surveys? Do you use this as an absolute prerequisite, perhaps as a gateway to program content, or do you do something else? I think this is great because we know young people, it can sometimes be like pulling teeth to get them to do a lot of things.
I mean, I'm happy to respond to that first, Gabby. Yes, we do incentivize. We incentivize our comparison group because I think without an incentive, it was very difficult for us to get them to complete the survey and then just sort of hang out for 6 weeks while the other students were in the program, and then get a post result from them. And so we did incentivize, and we incentivized with sort of like discounts for future AFS programs. We gave them a certificate for going on a virtual exchange themselves in the future. They could give it to a friend. So there were a variety of ways that we could incentivize in sort of a monetary way, but also in promoting programs. And then for the students who were taking the Global U Adventure program, we absolutely kept it as the gateway to the content. So until they provided the pre-survey information, they were unable to unlock the program. And then likewise, upon completion, we asked for their post-survey so that they could earn the certificate, as well as provide micro-credentials and things online as well.
Similar to Linda, for program participants, the pre-program survey is a prerequisite to participating in the program. I will just add a caveat here. There are on very rare occasions, situations where the institutional partner would request that we remove we basically exclude their students from taking part in the research for a variety of reasons. And so when that happens, we remove that, but that happens rarely. For everyone else, it's a prerequisite to participating in the program, and the post-program survey is a prerequisite to receiving the certificate of completion at the end of the semester. The control group, similarly, we also incentivize them. We do a raffle. If they complete both pre and post, they are eligible to enter in a raffle, and there's a few prizes.
Go ahead.
There was the added layer with the minors also of ensuring that we had the parental approval for them to participate in it as well. So likewise, if someone didn't feel comfortable, they did not have to participate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I've seen, like, from lots of different programs that the Stevens Initiative has supported, lots of different types of challenges. And so I think preparation, like getting out ahead of some of those issues like parental consent, partnership, like consent, that kind of thing is really, really important to successfully implementing evaluation. But I think maybe to the specific question, how, like incentives sound like really good like answers to completing surveys, and like what that looks like should respond to like what you can offer and what your students are interested in. So certificates, like Selma talked about, or Linda talked about, access to other programs is really important. Beyond incentives, I also think kind of like how you structure the surveys within your program is really important. And so are you building time into your program content for participants to complete surveys? I think has proven to be really effective. Like if you complete your program and then 2 weeks later send an email reminder to someone to take a survey, your response rate is going to be much less than if in the last session, or if you plan for your last session to be survey completion and like wrap up or whatever. And so I think some of those strategies also are also really important. Also, I think, thinking, how long does this survey need to be? How many things can we ask? I think that's important. Again, I'll reference our evaluation toolkit that's on our Stevens Initiative resource page. There are a list of we talk in that toolkit. RTI International talks about some effective ways of getting students to complete surveys. I think mention incentives, building in time, that kind of thing.
Yeah, all of that is so great. The second to last question that I'll pose to Kyle, maybe in the last minute or so that we have together for this, how do you capture stories that effectively share about the impact of virtual exchange? I know this has been a really research-heavy conversation, so maybe how do you effectively capture anecdotal evidence?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think what stories move us really depends on the person reading the story. One thing that I have found to be effective in our time, like trying to highlight the impact of virtual exchange on alumni or the impact of virtual exchange on participants, is really highlighting the student voice. Like, I don't need to say why a virtual exchange had an impact on a young person. The young person themselves can articulate that much better than I can. And it usually is so much more resonant, or they will share things that that I would never say. So I think approaching some of those anecdotes or that qualitative types of impact, approaching it from a very open perspective of reaching out to young people who participated in your programs and saying, what impact did it have on you? Stop. And alumni or participants of that program will share, and it's usually very moving. So I think centering, highlighting the voices of the young people themselves is really important. I wonder, Linda, I know you and Selma probably, if you had anything additional to share, you both worked on sharing the impact of virtual exchanges from participants. So
just the platform we use is Padlet, and that's where the students can record. That's where we center the voice and they can record. They also, they send a motivational letter to a future virtual exchange participant. So they sort of tell them like what to expect and wish them luck on their future journey.
I'm not sure, Selma, if you have thoughts on this, but I'm going to go right into our final question. So in 30 seconds or less, I would love for you all to answer, if there were no limits, what is the one finding you would want to know about the field? And whoever, Selma, would you like to start, or Linda? I see that you just unmuted. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that the student would say that this made a difference, right? That this virtual exchange had an impact on me, the people I met, the people that I'm now connected to, and that I walk through this world in some way, in some part, because of the virtual exchange that I had. I think that that would be transformational, and that would be proof of impact.
Just echoing what Linda said, we believe that these exchanges are transformational. Ultimately, we want to know if that's true. Are we helping, make better human beings who can make wiser and more empathetic decisions, especially during difficult moments? Are they choosing to engage more constructively with their surroundings? Are they more successful in navigating difficult dynamics at work because of their virtual exchange experience? These are the types of things, are they engaging more positively, constructively, working through challenges and conflicts, more effectively, really?
I think both of those, and so I'll let those stand for themselves. I think those would be my first choices. But if those were already taken, if we get three, and those two were also, maybe for the researcher or the virtual exchange practitioner, what I would love for us to have, so we could unlock other research, is maybe some sort of a unifying terminology or program model typology for virtual exchange. It's new, it's complicated, people don't really understand or only use the terms that they know, and they're not aware of different types of virtual exchanges that are out there. So I think some sort, if we could have anything, a unifying terminology or virtual exchange typology, would really set all of us up as practitioners and researchers and virtual exchange advocates to articulate the types of virtual exchange programs that are out there that might serve the needs of individual students.
Thank you all again for joining me today, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. If you have questions that weren't answered, or you just want to say hi to us, you can email us at stevensinitiative@aspeninstitute.org. You can also find us on social, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and you will each be added to our outreach list if you're not on it already, which is the best way to stay up to date on our future events and all other updates from us. So I will leave you all with this. Thank you again, panelists, and thank you. I will see you all at our next event. Bye.